Hi, thank you, Greet, for inviting me to participate in this first anniversary virtual conference of the Gifted Institute. I'm so happy to be back in Denmark, even virtually. I've had so many wonderful experiences in your country. This is a cartoon from my book, Upside Down Brilliance, The Visual Spatial Learner. There are so many more twice exceptional children in the population than anyone realizes. When I first started Gifted Development Center, we found that around 1/6 of the gifted children we tested had hidden disabilities. Nearly 44 years later, most of the children brought to us for assessment are twice exceptional. One of the main reasons we don't know which children are twice exceptional is that giftedness masks disabilities, and disabilities depress IQ scores. So the child may appear average in the classroom. Teachers might call the student lazy, unmotivated, not willing to put forth the effort to learn. But that's not the whole story. How can you tell if a child is twice exceptional? Parents have said to me, or teachers, I saw the tears in his eyes. You too may have held a distraught child who could not get the wonderful ideas in his or her head down on paper. The most asynchronous child is the one who is highly gifted and learning disabled. When giftedness is defined as developmental advancement or exceptional abstract reasoning or asynchronous development, it becomes readily apparent that children can have brilliant minds combined with any number of learning disabilities. These are the ones we most frequently see at Gifted Development Center: central auditory processing disorder, sensory processing disorder, visual processing weaknesses, dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and mood disorders. Today, I'm just going to address the first three: auditory, sensory, and visual processing issues. When a child struggles to learn, we are likely to look for someone to tell us what is wrong and how to fix it. Before we diagnose a child as having an inattentive type of ADHD, do we rule out auditory processing disorders? Before we diagnose a child as having nonverbal learning disorder or dyslexia, do we rule out visual processing deficits? Before we diagnose a child as autistic or OCD or a host of other personality disorders, do we rule out sensory processing disorder? Before we medicate, therapize, or reprogram their brains, do we recommend interventions in these disciplines? This is what I want us to do. Giftedness is exceptional reasoning. It can disguise a number of weaknesses. The greater your capacity for abstract reasoning, the more you can use reasoning to compensate for lack of modality strength in problem solving. But compensation is a two-edged sword. While it helps an individual to adapt, it also acts to prevent accurate diagnosis and recognition of disabilities by oneself and others. I studied special education at the University of Southern California, where I learned about modalities and about compensation. I thought that once you teach a child to compensate, they were home free. It took me 30 years to realize that compensation waxes and wanes. So what interferes with your ability to compensate? You cannot compensate well when you're tired, ill, injured, or dealing with stress or loss, or even when you're dieting. When you diet too strenuously, you lack enough caloric intake to be able to compensate. New situations are also a problem. What worked in elementary school may not work in high school. New compensations are needed as you age. Twice exceptional children are frequently misdiagnosed because they are compared to the norms for average children instead of to their own strength. Their lower scores may not be significantly below the norm. Their scores are averaged in full-scale IQ scores and composite scores, masking both their strengths and their weaknesses. Their ability to compensate often inflates their lower scores. and the magnitude of disparities between their strengths and weaknesses are not taken into account. I knew one extremely clever psychologist who tested for giftedness in the morning when the child's compensations were very strong and fresh, and she tested for disabilities in the late afternoon when the child was tired and compensations didn't work as well. The diagnostic question most often asked is, how does this child's performance compare to the norm? That's the question all diagnosticians are taught to ask. If a child scores within the average range, no disability is detected. This is what I call normative testing. We need a completely different approach to diagnose twice exceptional children. It's necessary to ask a different diagnostic question. To what extent does the discrepancy between this child's strengths and weaknesses cause frustration and interfere with the full development of the child's abilities? This is an interpersonal view of testing. At the Gifted Development Center, we have a developmental questionnaire, and one of our questions is, what is your child's least favorite subject? Can you guess? Handwriting. Many parents tell us things like, he struggles with written work, his handwriting is disastrous, her handwriting is so terrible, they've created an individual educational plan so that she can keyboard. Her handwriting is unreadable. So why is handwriting so difficult? There are many names for writing disability, which is what I coined: dysgraphia, developmental coordination disorder, but I use writing disability because I think it's easier for teachers and parents to understand. So the first thing on the list is odd pencil grip. Take a look at the pencil grip of the child in this picture and in the next picture that I'm going to show you. Not holding the paper in place, writing letters from the bottom up instead of from the top down, making letters too small, too large, or too close together, illegible handwriting, strange spacing, mixing upper and lowercase letters, mixing cursive and manuscript letters, fatigue when writing. Writing is not supposed to be torture, physical discomfort when writing, and the excessive time needed for assignments. Occupational therapy can help handwriting. It works best with children under 7. With older children, switching to a keyboard is probably the best solution. The following symptoms can be seen from the time children are very young. If you see these symptoms, the child should have an occupational therapy evaluation. Difficulty establishing handedness in the early years, clumsiness and frequent tripping, sensitivity to touch and grooming, food avoidance, wearing similar soft clothes every day, sensory seeking behaviors, sensory avoidance, emotional dysregulation, tantrums, and overstimulation. A child who looks like this, who is having a lot of tantrums, especially in school, is very likely to be given a host of different labels. Try sensory integration therapy first. Difficulty mastering a 2-wheel bicycle, inability to tie shoes, lack of coordination. That affects handwriting. It affects tying shoes and bicycle riding and athletic ability. Poor endurance, discomfort with crowds, difficulty with transitions, propping oneself up in a chair rather than sitting up straight, and fear of heights. Occupational therapy helps fine and gross motor development, emotional regulation, sensory modulation, and so many other issues. I usually recommend occupational therapy before other interventions to integrate the left and right sides of the body. That helps integrate the two eyes, integrate the two ears, and integrate the hands with the eyes for eye-hand coordination. And now we're going to talk about auditory processing issues. And this is the woman, Dr. Marion Downs, who taught me the most about auditory processing. It was really auditory processing weaknesses that I noted first when I first started the Gifted Development Center. And this story begins in 1985, when USA Today was a brand new paper, and I was a brand new psychologist. And as a new psychologist, I was asked to list all of these different topics that I'd be willing to talk with to the press. First on my list, of course, was giftedness in great big block letters. Nobody asked me about giftedness. Second was adolescent development, because I was teaching adolescent development at the University of Denver. And I also had brought 6 adolescents into my home in a group care home. So that was something I knew a little bit about. And the very first call I got from a reporter was from someone at USA Today asking what was the impact of Madonna on teenage values. Now, I didn't even know who Madonna was, but I have the gift of gab, and I was able to just talk about anything that came to my head while I wrote a note to my daughter saying, who is Madonna? And she pantomimed this sexy rock star. So I said, well, I believe parents have the greatest impact on their teenage children's values, but what you really want to know about is gifted children. And I switched topics on the reporter without taking a breath, and then rattled off everything I could possibly think of that might get her attention. And one of the things I said was that I noticed that underachieving gifted children often had a lot of ear infections, and that caught her attention. And she wrote a front page article in USA Today on the relationship between chronic ear infections and underachievement. And Dr. Marion Downs read my article on a plane on the way back to Denver, and she called me. And we developed a collaboration from that time forward that was just divine. I have to tell you that this woman was such a role model that I aspired to be her when I grow up. This is a picture of Marion at 90, where she's skydiving, and she wrote the book at 90, Shut Up and Live, You Know How. You can imagine what a delight she was to have in my life. And from Marion, I learned that recurrent otitis media, which is more than 9 ear infections, especially in the first 3 years of life, has long-term sequelae impact. Most people think, oh, well, ear infections, all kids have them, nothing to worry about, but that's not true. They can result in auditory processing disorders and in fine motor issues. Kids who had at least 9 ear infections have trouble paying attention in school. They have trouble with listening skills. They have trouble with spelling. They have trouble with rote memorization. And look at this, handwriting. Here is a recent description of reported behaviors of 100 gifted individuals with central auditory processing disorder. This comes from the Able Kids Foundation, an audiological center in Colorado. And I just took the top 11. Sensitive to loud sounds, 79%. Easily distracted, 71%. You can see why kids with ADHD might be thought of as having ADHD when they really have CAPD. Difficulty following directions, 70%. Easily frustrated, 67%. Experiences anxiety, 66%. Writing difficulties, 60% of kids who have documented CAPD have difficulty with writing. History of ear infections, 56%. Mishears, 55%. Forgetful, 55%. Appears confused in noisy places, 55%. And difficulty completing assignments, 55%. Here are some other symptoms that are not in that list that we've noticed in the kids who've come to our center for assessment. The ones who need repetitions before responding, who mispronounce words, who confuse similar sounding words like agent and ancient, who misunderstand information, who have a weak grasp of phonics, children who have a loud voice, particularly when there's background noise, and those who get low scores on digit span and comprehension. So now let's take a look at visual processing issues. These are the common symptoms that we see in the children who come to Gifted Development Center. Difficulty with reading comprehension, skipping lines and losing their place when reading. Many early readers suddenly stopped reading when the print became too small for their eyes to be able to focus. And I have careless in quotation marks because some of these careless errors are simply not seeing the difference between a plus and a minus or a plus and a multiplication sign. Careless errors in written work, misalignment of numbers, mixing up signs, poor spacing when writing, difficulty copying from the board, putting face too close to paper when writing, and poor at athletics. Tiring easily when reading or writing is yet another one. So again, writing could be a visual processing issue. When I give block design, when any of our testers give block design, they look carefully at the child's behavior. And these are some of the symptoms of visual processing issues that show up just from this one subtest. Many children who have trouble with visual processing use verbal mediation and talk their way through solving the designs, or they solve the problem correctly, but after time limits and they don't get credit. They don't notice that all the blocks are alike. So they're turning them, trying to find the right block and not realizing that they're all exactly identical. They will often reverse the red and white blocks, or they break configuration, not seeing that it's a square and that they have to create a square. Some of them have difficulty with angles. Some use a trial and error approach without ever noticing patterns. Like if they put two of the red triangles together, it looks like the top of the roof of a house. Moving a block out of its correct position, or saying things like, that's impossible. Visual, auditory, and sensory issues are much easier to correct than many of the other kinds of issues like ADHD or nonverbal learning disorder that a child might be diagnosed with. And so those modalities need to be checked first. Now I'm going to show you some actual test protocols. In the first child, you'll notice that all of the ones at the top of the first section, that's the verbal comprehension section, are at the top of the test. 19, 18, 19, and 19. And block design is also at the top of the test. By comparison, the child's coding score, which is eye-hand coordination and speed, is only a 6. And the difference between 19 and 6 is 13 points, more than 4 standard deviations. The child's verbal comprehension score is 150, whereas the processing speed score is only 95. That's a difference of 55 points, nearly 4 standard deviations. In this next child, the highest score was in similarities, that's a 19, but coding is only 4. That's in the disabled range. And the discrepancy is 15 points. That is 5 standard deviations. In Giftedness 101, I recommend that when the composite scores vary by 30 points, or when the subtest scores vary by 9 points, the child is likely twice exceptional. The high scores should be recognized as the approximate level of the child's abilities, and the low scores should be interpreted as significant weaknesses, possibly improvable through therapeutic intervention. This chart has the blue line of the Gifted Development Center clients, the first 51 who had taken the WISC-5, and the red line are match controls from the norm sample that was done by the test constructor. And you'll see that VCI, that verbal comprehension index, was 132.6, the mean score of those 51 kids. That's the average score that shows they're gifted verbally. And the VECI is all 4 subtests, which was their very highest score. All 4 verbal subtests rendered a score of 134. But their lowest score was in processing speed, which was even lower than the match controls in the norm sample. The match controls had 104.7, and the Gifted Development Center sample had 104.2. The discrepancy was almost 2 standard deviations between processing speed and verbal expanded crystallized index, almost 30 points. And that was the first 51 kids. So you can see that in gifted children, processing speed and eye-hand coordination are going to be typically their lowest scores. They should not be included in an attempt to figure out who belongs in a gifted program. To recognize giftedness in twice exceptional children, we must always be on the lookout for strengths and take them seriously when they appear. Strengths give us a window into the child's abilities. This is the lens through which we should look at any child. Ron Davis in The Gift of Dyslexia said, "Genius does not occur in spite of disabilities, rather it occurs because of disabilities." And we see this over and over again at Gifted Development Center and in the literature, like the Gift of Dyslexia, or The Dyslexic Advantage, or In the Mind's Eye by Thomas West. All of these books talk about how disabilities actually help a person see the world in such a different way that they come up with innovations that nobody else thinks of. With the right support, twice exceptional individuals become some of our most creative, most productive innovators, people who change the world. Thank you.